Hello and welcome to another episode of My Pocket Psych, the podcast all about the psychology of the workplace. I'm your host, Dr. Richard McKinnon, chartered psychologist and coach. Well, I'm delighted to be joined by two new faces to the podcast. I've got Dr. Ian Tyndall, who's from the University of Chichester, and Dr. Daniel Waldeck from Coventry University. Daniel, if we could start with you, could you tell us a little about who you are and what you do?
Sure, thank you. So I'm Dan Waldeck and I am a lecturer at Coventry University. I course direct as the BSc Psychology with Counselling, and my primary area of research interest is in ostracism, so how people feel ignored or excluded by other people, and ultimately how people cope with those kinds of experiences, but also more recently what predicts who will feel ostracised more than others.
So, spoiler alert, that's the topic for today. We're going to be looking at this experience of ostracism.
Oh, yeah.
Perfect introduction. Ian, how about you? Who are you and what do you do?
Hi, Richard. So I'm Dr. Ian Tyndall, and I'm a reader in cognitive psychology at the University of Chichester, and we're here on the south coast of England, between Brighton and Portsmouth. I did my degrees in Galway in Ireland, and that's when I got interested in relational frame theory and acceptance and commitment therapy, and I did my PhD under Brian Roach in that specific area. So I've continued that line of work here at Chichester, and I do a lot of work on just understanding how language and cognition works in a range of settings, across education settings, across health settings, and across clinical and counselling and therapy sessions, and quite recently in coaching settings as well.
Listeners who've been paying attention will have recognized Ian's name because we've mentioned him several times when we were referring to the University of Chichester's recent coaching psychology conference, when we all got together down in Chichester to talk about aspects of coaching psychology. So if you've heard the name, that's how you've done it. So look, we're here to discuss this topic of ostracism. Let me open it up. I'd actually like to know why you're particularly interested in this topic before we get into what it is actually.
So I was initially interested in this topic because I used to work in residential care homes. I used to support individuals with various mental health diagnoses, in particular a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. And I was quite surprised when I would go with the service users to various appointments, so like to see the GP and see the psychiatrist, but all questions were pretty much directed only to me as the member of staff there. And I felt, well, firstly, that's quite rude. Also, it's making assumptions about the other person's level of capacity. But how must this person feel? So I really wanted to kind of investigate that feeling of exclusion and how do people actually cope with those kinds of experiences. Now, as we might come on to this later, and Ian will remember this, what we realised was it isn't necessarily whether someone is ostracised or not, or whether someone's is more likely to be ostracised, has a sensitivity to it. It's more about the perception of ostracism, and that is important, which I'm sure we'll come on to later.
Thank you for that. Ian, what about you? What's your professional interest in this?
I've done quite a bit of research in social psychology and social domains, and then when Daniel came and to Chichester, and we were discussing potential avenues for his PhD research. Daniel pitched autism really, really well, and then we were trying to think what kind of models are out there that might help us to understand how people cope with, how people process the autism experience, and that, as Daniel said, specifically when they perceive it in a specific way. And then, is there anything else any models out there that can help us to understand how people can kind of bounce back from autism, because it really does hurt. And then that's when we came up with the angle of coming at it from the psychological flexibility model that underpins acceptance and commitment therapy, that I know a lot of your listeners will be very familiar with. And we just saw in that, and that there's a number of different component processes that seemed ideally suited to try and understand how a person takes in the autism experience, how they reflect on it, how they ruminate on it, how they make meaning of it. And what's the response? Is it one to avoid the inner thoughts and feelings and sensations that are pretty horrible? They're pretty aversive when someone has excluded you, whether it's in the workplace or whether it's in a family, or whether it's in a social club or something that's based around your hobbies or your interests. And like we've known from the social psychology research that it is painful. Like it is literally painful to be excluded. So we wanted to look at a model of that. We thought that the psychological flexibility model offered some scope. It might seem, well, any model could offer some scope, but when we initially tried to publish this work, we got some kind of resistance and saying, why are you mixing up social psychology, which is the ostracism, social exclusion, and clinical counseling psychology, which is the psychological flexibility and acceptance and commitment therapy? And our argument is that they're not separate and divided. People exist in social contexts, a lot of clinical problems that you might see, and also in the workplace, a lot of kind of emotional problems, a lot of work difficulties that you might see in the workplace that can lead to emotional difficulties and challenges and so on, like that from autism occur in social domain. So you can't separate them out. So it's something that I got really excited about, and then we wanted to explore it a little bit before using kind of Steve Hayes' model.
For listeners, to signpost all the resources we have about psychological flexibility, you can find those on the website at worklifepsych.com/psychological flexibility. If you are a long-time listener, you'll know we've gone through the whole model very recently to explain all of this. And if you're listening, you'll probably be nodding along with Ian there as well, because we've explained how all of this stuff applies to all of us as humans because we have minds. So, kind of regardless of which context or which lens we look through, we can find relevance to our values, our thinking, our behavior, what we move towards, what we move away from. And Dan, you've outlined your personal interest because you saw it in action in one particular context. If we go back to basics, is ostracism simply when we believe we're being excluded, whether that's intentional or not? We actually arrive at that evaluation.
So, in terms of the main definition by Professor Kip Williams, he coins it as the act of being ignored and or excluded by others, like other individuals or other groups. And yes, I would say that this is mostly the perception of being ignored, avoided, or excluded by other people. So whether that be even just one person or a whole group, no matter how large that group may be.
Because when we discussed loneliness on the podcast before, and when we've written about it, we talked about that core human need for connection that we have. Now we vary in how much we want of that, but when we don't get enough, it's painful, it hurts, and that might be of our own making or circumstances. But when it's intentionally or otherwise done to us by others, it makes sense that it hurts. It makes sense that it is a really unpleasant experience, right?
Yeah, I'll come in here, Richard. So I think Daniel mentioned Kip Williams, so he's a world leader in autism research, and he's got a theory called the temporal needs threat model of autism. It sounds complicated, but it's actually really straightforward as far as models in psychology go. So, but the first stage is that you perceive that you've been ostracized, and you literally have that painful response, just like you've mentioned there, Richard. And during this stage, we all generally feel it. And then when we go on to the next stage, which is their reflective stage. So during their reflective stage, which happens quite quickly, we have that quick rumination on it, and we're just trying to kind of appraise it and say, what were the motives behind the person who has ostracized me, whether it's your parents or whether it's a colleague at work. For example, if you're the only person who hasn't been invited to a wedding, everyone else at work has, but you're the only one who hasn't. Like, what's the motives behind that? What does it mean for you? What does it mean for you in this workplace, and do you belong, or is everyone wanting to do not see you being a valuable member of the team, and this is just the beginning of you being excluded over time. So, but generally people will recover during this stage quite quickly during the reflective stage. But if you've been chronically ostracized, when you've been repeatedly ostracized over time, that you've seen like the black sheep of the family or something like that, and then it's during this, then the outcomes are quite poor for people being chronically ostracized, and they tend to become alienated. They tend to feel unworthy of any kind of love, any kind of affection, any kind of sense of belonging, any sense of worth, and they can feel helpless. Like no matter what they do, they can't regain their kind of previous status within the group. No matter what they do, people will not allow them in. They won't be invited to social situations, etc. So they feel that nothing they can do can help them. So they feel utterly helpless. So that's quite an extreme version. But generally speaking, you will only go to that if you've been chronically ostracized over time. But Kip Williams, he refers to four basic needs. And just what it's alluding to what you're talking about, Richard, in terms of that need to belong and that we are social creatures. So one of the four needs that is depleted when we're ostracized is our need to belong. As you said, that humans have an innate need to belong, and it does seem that this is biologically hardwired in us. And he Williams refers to tribes in the past, and that they were very close knit. They were very the groups were really small, really tight hunter gatherers, and the chances of survival really depended on that close knit tight group. And if you're ostracized or excluded from that group and you had to leave, say, the village, and you had to fend for yourself, your chances of survival were greatly reduced. And that's where we think the idea of social death comes from. So it's very much related to that need for the need to belong. There's also the need for control, that you don't have control over your environment anymore. You can't make those decisions. Other people are not messaging you on WhatsApp. They're not inviting you to the canteen at work. They're not inviting you to work nights out, for example. You're not invited to family wedding. You can't make the decision to go because you haven't been invited. Your control is gone. It also impacts your sense of meaning in life, like what is life for, and what is your role in that, especially if you identified yourself so strongly with your organization, for example, that your job defines you, and that your team defines you, and you find you're ostracized from that, then your whole sense of who you are can be shattered quite severely, and then you have to try and identify where your meaning is in life somewhere else, and that can take a lot of time.
So you've got belonging, self-esteem, control, and meaningful existence.
Yeah.
And so I was going to say that why ostracism is so powerful is because it can affect all four of those needs simultaneously. Whereas, let's say you're in a argument at the workplace, there can still be a sense of control over the dynamic and the argument. So you could potentially escalate the argument, could potentially de-escalate. You have a control over that interaction. But ostracism affects all of those needs, or it can affect all of those needs at the same time, which can lead to even more distress potentially.
When you mentioned pain as well, Richard, earlier on, there's a big debate in literature currently about whether social pain is the same as physical pain. So when you get your hand trapped in your car door, and is that pain the same kind of thing if someone excludes you from work, you're the only one that hasn't been invited down for the work lunch? And they might seem quite different, but they do tend to activate similar parts of the brain. So when we do the brain scans, or fMRI scans and PET scans, it tends to be very similar parts of the brain. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the exact same part, because there's a big scientific debate over whether it's exactly the same or not.
So there's a couple of key words in there, aren't there? Because, pain is pain. If it's happening to you, are you thinking about,
Yeah.
your neurology and how your brain is wired, or are you focused on how awful the experience is? And also, what are you learning from that? And how might it encourage you to stay apart, or not reach out, or not try and find out why it's happening because it's so painful? You can really understand why someone might continue that exclusion because that's safe, rather than risk further exclusion or further interaction. And Dan, your comparison with an argument is a great one, because when we're still in contact with people, we can learn more about what's going on. It sounds like one of the really difficult things, the meaning part of ostracism, is not knowing why or not knowing all of the motivation behind it or all the mechanism. It's something that's being done to you. I mean, it's almost like the weather. It's like, why is it even happening? And it's happening to me and I don't like it. There's a lot of unknowns in there, right?
That's right. And ultimately, within the reflection stage, this is where people start providing that analysis of what has happened. So why has it happened to me? Is it actually ostracism? And providing that attribution in terms of, is it me? You know, I'm ignored because I'm ugly, or I'm unlovable, or whatever the causes that they believe could be for themselves. Or it could be an external attribution. So no, that person's just a jerk. They don't like anyone. Or it could just be the situation. So I've been ignored at this work event because clearly that everyone is busy and it's not actually personal. So the reflection stage is where people do go through that appraisal and think about the relevance and the meaning of that ostracism event. Now, for many people, that can be a relatively fast process, and people can cope quite quickly. And this has been shown within several cyberball studies that people cope quite quickly, even within a 8 to 10 minute period. For example, they restore those needs that are threatened across that time frame. But what the temporal need threat model also does, it suggests the actions that we do after we've had that reflection process. So how do we actually restore those needs beyond our own reflection on the event? So that can be trying to redeem ourselves with the group. So if we were quite a loud person, then it might be becoming a bit quieter and a bit more trying to be less noisy in the group and trying to ingratiate oneself with the group. I mean, if I remember back to our interviews, Ian, there was one participant that said, I become the chessboard and not the chess piece. So this person was particularly shy, and they just wanted to try to get back in the group with the group, but not be challenging in some kind of way. So some people might try to do that to get restore that sense of belonging. Some might seek out a new opportunity for a different group and realise, actually, no, these people that are ostracising me, this isn't what they're not meeting my needs. I'm going to seek my need for belonging elsewhere. But for some, it might be trying to restore a sense of control, and that might involve acting out and being aggressive, for example, to assert that sense of dominance back in an interaction.
Because when you get feedback that's difficult to hear,
Yeah.
you at least have heard the message, and you can act on it or not act on it. It's in your gift. But when you don't know why this is happening, you've got, as Dan said, that sort of trial and error. I might try things to reingratiate or become part of the group again, but you're not quite sure what it's about unless someone has told you.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I think, Richard, because there's lots of other exclusion studies when people know why they've been excluded. So they've been excluded due to their gender identity, to their sexual orientation, to their race, to their skin color, cultural background, etc. And then you've been excluded by a bigot or a bigoted group or a prejudiced group and so on. But that leads to kind of annoyance and anger, because you know why you've been excluded. With ostracism, as you said, Richard, you and Daniel has pointed out, you often don't know why, and you're left with that kind of rumination, trying to think of all the different contexts that you've been with them. What did you possibly do wrong? Was it your behavior? Was it the way you look? Was it something you said, etc.? Is there something fundamentally wrong with you? And it's all that kind of torturous rumination, often the not knowing, that leads to helplessness and the lack of control that you mentioned. But it's also interesting that there's other studies done where when you get ostracized by groups you don't even want to belong to.
Yep.
Like, for example, they did a study it's a fictional study on the KKK. So you've been ostracized by the Ku Klux Klan that no one would, in the right mind, would want to be part of. But even when you're told to be ostracized by them, then you still want to almost like belong, even though it's not a group you even identify with at all. just because you've been excluded, feels that we just need to get that control back in. I said the dominance back in, even with undesirable, with really horrible values and
That
qualities. Like,
that doesn't blow my mind in as much as I thought it might, because I'm reflecting on coachees I've had over the years where the focus of our coaching is enabling them to increase their interpersonal effectiveness with people they don't know. So the dreaded networking events they might need to go to. And a concern that's in the top three for virtually all of them is, what if someone won't speak to me? It's not what if I make a mistake. It's what if these people who I don't even know yet don't engage with me when I speak to them. So it seems like there's a sort of a low level of that anyway. It doesn't have to be an extreme group that doesn't want you. It's just a lack of reciprocity in that can feel really quite grim, even though it hasn't happened yet. We know within us that that would be an unpleasant experience.
Yeah, exactly.
So, tough question. What can people do if someone is listening to this and they say, right, ostracism, that's the word for that experience I've had over the last few months. Are there any positive steps people can take when they've had that experience?
Well, I mean, Ian, I think I'll field this to Ian when it comes to psychological flexibility. But in terms of the temporal need threat model, it would suggest that, well, the usual way in which people try to cope is by or a way that they can cope is by restoring those needs through trying to re-ingratiate themselves. But that may not necessarily be successful, because it's not just dependent on our actions, it's also dependent on the other group or the other individual and whether they're going to accept us back into that group. And that's also depending on whether our perception is right in the first place, whether we have actually been ignored. Are we actually over-egging the pudding, in a sense, by, catastrophizing the event more than it was? But I would say in a workplace environment, I would say that one way to try and address the elephant in the room is to speak with your supervisor, for example, and because ultimately workplace ostracism would be under the umbrella of workplace bullying. But the issue with this is that it can be quite deniable. So even though you feel that someone has been excluding you, the other person can just say, no, I didn't. And it's difficult to prove that because it can be down to the perception. But I would suggest speaking to the line manager, seeking out support from them. But I would say, again, to try to see what the policies are around workplace bullying and to go through the relevant company protocols to get that, I would say, victim support if you are feeling victimized because of that behavior. On a more broader level, in terms of what would you do as an employer, it would be primarily a case of trying to promote as inclusive a culture as possible. And try to promote people to reach out, but also to include people within as many activities as possible, even if someone is appearing to be lonely or appearing to be antagonistic, trying to engage them as much as possible. Because antagonistic traits, for example, that can be a major cause of people being actually excluded, because the more disagreeable someone behaves, the more they will actually be excluded from the group because they are perceived to be a burden to others.
No, I was just going to say, this came up yesterday in a Q&A I was doing with a client organization around workplace well-being, and actually the unintentional ignoring of people who are working remotely, almost out of sight, out of mind. If you're working away, not making a fuss, the people who are physically together can find it much easier to arrange things and do things, and unintentionally leave someone out, or not even just check in with them to see how they're doing. So it struck me that there's a level of proactivity about this at an organizational, cultural level, but also for individuals, just to, have that little check-in, that little chat, which we know is really powerful for making connections. These don't need to be big, showy things. And if we're all doing that all the time, it's less likely that less likely that people will feel that ostracism if it's unintentional. Ian, let's look at this through the ACT lens. Acceptance and commitment theory, as
Yeah.
I've been referring to it outside of therapeutic contexts. What kind of meaning can we draw from it using that?
Thanks, Richard. I would say Daniel mentioned a qualitative study that we published back in 2015 in the qualitative report, and it's still one of the most powerful pieces of research I think we've done, because they're really in-depth studies on autism with people in the community and in the workplaces. Like, we had bank managers and everything. It wasn't just a typical kind of university student sample, and I was really struck by how powerful the event was. It's like they're traveling back in time to that autism event, even if it's 5 years ago, and the emotions come and they're welling up. The tears were coming through. People were clenching their fists. Some people were picking at their skin. Some people twirling their hair while they're describing. And yet they're very successful people, say, in the industry and in working life, and the managers. You wouldn't normally expect them to see them at that, but just when we were asked them to reflect on this autism experience, whether it's in the family or in the workplace, they do travel back into that moment as if they're right in there right now again, experiencing that awesome event, and all those feelings are intense. And it was just really interesting, the language that they use, even though none of them were socialized to the acceptance and commitment theory kind of model that you mentioned, and yet they're using terms and sentences that we would see as classic examples of. Daniel mentioned as well earlier with the chessboard, of experiential avoidance and kind of self as content, and I'll go to those in a moment, and also predominantly cognitive fusion. And what we would say by that is that they did say things like, well, I deserved it, I'm unlovable, that I'm unworthy. And they were thinking that those thoughts were literally true of themselves, that they were defined by this. And it's almost like these thoughts imprisoned them, that nothing, they somehow deserve to be ostracized by their family or by the work colleagues. And even though they're very successful in another domain in life, and so just there, they'd say that that was where they were a loser and they were a failure. And they would say this and they'd literally believe it to be true of themselves. And we can see, so when you're cognitively fused with thoughts, it just simply means that you literally believe them to be true of yourself, and they're very profound. It just literally is a complete, obvious statement to you. It must be obvious to everyone else because it's obvious to the person. And then the more you say of that, then you become attached to that self story. So we kind of call it in that theory as self as content. That just means that the story you've been telling about yourself becomes deeply embedded, and you become very much attached to that story you've been telling yourself, that you are literally unlovable, you're unworthy, you're a loser. And it's done yourself. You can even think that you're ostracized because you're ugly or something like that, even though it's very unlikely to be true, but you genuinely believe these things. It is hard to change those because these stories they've been telling themselves for a long time. But experiential avoidance seems to come across a lot. They would say that they would do anything to push it away. And we ask them, well, what do you do when these memories come up? And they would literally say, I have 2 bottles of wine. Or I just go and I watch Netflix and I just binge on it. But so they would say, what, and we ask them what it was, it's to push it away. It's to push those unpleasant feelings, those thoughts and then sensations and those memories as they come up, especially with them, with the hearts racing and the palms are getting sweaty and everything. It just feels as if you're in that moment again. So they were engaging in experiential avoidance. They were cognitive fusive thoughts. They were creating this very deeply embedded story they're attached to. They weren't mindful at all. They weren't in the present moment. They were traveled back to the past and they were stuck there. So they weren't in the present moment. They had this kind of conceptualized past and going back to in that moment, whether it's 2 months ago, 5 years ago, and so on. And we said that some of their actions were quite impulsive, and they didn't seem to be connecting with what their values were going forward for the future. And so we believed on the basis of our interviews that cognitive fusion would be the most important. When you're fused with thoughts, that'd be the most uh, important predictor. But when we did a moderated a model and mediation models, we found that experiential avoidance and cognitive fusion were both important. But when you put them together in the same statistical model, that experiential avoidance accounted for pretty much all of the variance of cognitive fusion. And to try and put that in simple terms, it just simply means that experiential avoidance dominated cognitive fusion, explained most of cognitive fusion's effects. So when we say that experiential avoidance is a major part of acceptance commitment theory, as you've been saying to your listeners over the last 15 months, that so it seems that when you push away those thoughts, feelings, and sensations about oxygen, it persists in the long run. It seems to be successful in the short run. It's worked for now. You've had that relief, whether you drank alcohol, you're slightly drunk, or you're binging on a mindless TV program and so on. It seems to work for the moment. You're not thinking about it, but it leaves that kind of unresolved, that tension and that stress about the awesome, and then it comes back and hurts you at a later point, probably when you're least expecting it. and you might break down in tears in public in a shopping center, or when you're on a train or something, or at a family occasion. It's got nothing to do with the Austin event. It just you feel overwhelmed with your defenses. So it seemed from these studies that we're doing, and experiential avoidance was really important. But then the story got a bit murky as we went along. When we did further research and we started to understand a bit better. So we did experimental studies in the lab, and Daniel mentioned cyberball. So cyberball is a simple computer game, and participants think that you have to cooperate and you have to get points and so on. So all involved is three figures, and you're an avatar, and the ball is being passed to you, and you have to pass to someone else. So there's three people. So in the inclusion condition, you're passed the ball equally. So each person gets the ball 33% of the time. So you're very much involved in the group. And in the ostracism condition, you pass the ball twice at the beginning of the game, and then you never pass the ball at all for the rest of the game. So you just see the other two characters on screen passing to each other and never passing to you. And you think, well, that's really gimmicky and simple. It's only a game. But that always depletes those four needs. So we've repeated this so many times, and we've done undergraduate studies as well as the larger scale studies done with students here at Chichester and students at Coventry, and we're finding the exact same effect over and over again. Even something as simple as cyberball depletes your sense of meaning, it depletes your sense of control, it depletes your self-esteem levels, and it depletes your need to belong. So it really does sting and it does hurt. And so we found that experiential avoidance was really important in that experimental context. So if you scored high on experiential avoidance, you suffered more from the ostracism. And if you scored low on experiential avoidance questionnaire, you tended, it meant that you bounced back that bit quicker. Like it still hurt, but you regain those four needs that bit quicker. But if you're high in experiential avoidance, it took you much longer to refortify those psychological needs that have been depleted. So experiential avoidance is not good, as the model, as the ACT model will tell us anyway. But in terms of your initial question, Richard, I still think that if you can engage in some acceptance based work, you will bounce back quicker. And if you can help your client to identify the values and say, do you really want like if those kinds of people will do that to you, are they the kind of people that you want to be associated with? Or do they share values with you? And you'd be surprised with that kind of work that a lot of your clients never ever think about values, even though we think we all do. But a lot of us seem to function by values but not be aware of them. So just getting to those exercises, they can bounce back that bit quicker and see there's other people that value them more. They're not ostracized by everybody, just loads of other people they have good connections with, and they'll start moving towards those, and they'll commit to some actions that will help them with that. And just trying to loosen up cognitive fusion. So we do some diffusion work, even say, I'm having the thought that I'm unworthy. I'm having the thought that no one likes me. And so on. If you're doing that kind of work, putting a sentence stem at the beginning of that kind of phrase, surprising that things can work, or repeating the phrase over and over again, no, I'm unworthy or I'm unlovable. And over time, those words will have less control over your clients. They'll have less control over your emotions and your actions and your feelings going forward. So those kind of diffusion exercises can be quite simple but effective. And trying to open up and be accepting of the experience rather than avoiding it, trying to identify your values and then move forward with committed actions. And try to loosen that self story I mentioned earlier on. Daniel
I'll
has
put
mentioned as well.
links to each of those skills in the show notes because we've done different episodes on each one of those. And if this is the first episode you're encountering, there might be a lot of their things to take in there. So we'll signpost that stuff. But it's great to hear. This is another context where psychological flexibility benefits us. And it makes total sense the way you explain that. It makes total sense that building those capacities, building those skills enables us to persist, to act and take steps towards something that's important rather than keep trying to avoid things, because avoidance works in the very short term. We all know that. Whether you're procrastinating or you're just avoiding social contact, it can keep you safe from unpleasant feelings, but that's not who you want to be ultimately. Dan, you were going to say something there. I saw a thought forming on your lips.
So Ian's focused on our research that's looked at ostracism in the context of psychological distress. So, as Ian's mentioned, experiential avoidance does seem to be important, but we've also looked at experiential avoidance in the context of other outcomes. So we've looked at ostracism and how it relates to paranoia. and we found that there was a strong positive relationship between the more people feel like they're ignored by others, the more sensitive that they are to threats from their external environment. We've also looked at sleep. So ostracism was, and we replicated the work of other researchers in the literature, which showed that ostracism does lead to a decrease in sleep quality. And what we wanted to look at was the psychological mechanisms behind that. So we tested, firstly, looking at mediation to see, once people are ostracized, this would lead to more cognitive arousal before we fall asleep. So when we're ruminating, it might lead to more cognitive arousal. So if we're overplaying the event that's just happened to us at work, for example. And we replicated that from previous research. So we found a mediation effect. So this link between ostracism and sleep was explained via cognitive arousal.
So we based our research, it was inspired by research by Pereira et al. In 2013 when they looked at daily ostracism experience at work and then the effect on the subsequent night's sleep. So it is the work is all very much based in the workplace. Is always very relevant. I think the workplace is a big driver for most autism research, and that's where we tend to, and that's where a lot of people report the most autism is at work. Second would be families, I think, and then but a lot of the autism, they say the worst of it for them is at the workplace, and that affects their sleep at night. But as Daniel said, it is the cognitive arousal that keeps you awake. Whether you're at 2 or 3 a.m. and you're ruminating over and again why we excluded a work from that particular event or that particular occasion. So in that sense, experience avoidance mightn't work so well in that particular context. So I think with the act theory model, it's very nuanced about when it's effective and the different contexts. I think that makes sense anyway. But there are other times when more positive psychology approach might work, or a CBT based approach might work as well. So they can all kind of work together in an integrated
There's
fashion.
a couple of things in what you've been saying there that really jump out at me. I mean, I'm particularly interested in the link between work and sleep and work, and that's included in most of the well-being programs I run for my clients. So just even psychoeducation, so people understand how sleep is benefiting them and how disrupting their sleep detracts from our well-being. But absolutely, rumination over the day's events is going to disrupt your sleep. And it strikes me as well, maybe some of the maladaptive coping strategies as well, such as alcohol. I mean, it's definitely going to shred your restorative sleep, and anything else you might be doing can come between you and a good night's sleep. And it also points to the fact that what kind of colleague will you be the next day when you haven't had enough sleep? Managing your emotions is going to be more difficult. You can be hypersensitive. You might make more mistakes, and then you're relying on caffeine and sugar to get you through the day. So you can see it's not a one-off conversation. It could be an ongoing thing, which brings me to my final big point, because we're talking fundamentally about a social / well-being topic here. That's how I would frame this. I'm always cautious that we don't leave people with the impression that it's up to them as an individual to sort this out. We've talked about some things people can do if they're experiencing this, but I'd love to hammer home the message of the inclusive workplace, and that organizations have a duty of care to ensure that there's an understanding of how to minimize this happening and to nip it in the bud, to do something about it when it is brought to their attention. We can't leave well-being at the feet of the individual employee for everything. So I think it's important to share that top-down and bottom-up message with listeners. Guys, it's been fantastic, and I also feel I've only just scratched the surface of this. I think this is something we will revisit, and I know based on the listeners we will get some questions about this, so we may have another conversation going into more depth. But for now, to both of you, Dan and Ian, thank you so much for your time. It's been a really interesting conversation. I've learnt loads. I'm sure the listeners have too, and I look forward to speaking with you again.